Yeah, my name's Fred Collins, and I have been involved with Audubon since 1972, I suppose. And I joined the board, I believe, in '73 and served until '86. And then subsequently, I was on the board again when Stenny Metters was president. Um, and I think total I was on the board for 17 years. Uh, and then I've been on the advisory board for Houston Audubon for the last 20 years or more. Went to Texas A&M University, and I studied wildlife biology, have a degree in wildlife science, and went to master's, did a master's program at A&M after my bachelor's, and was up there 3 years working on that. I never actually completed my thesis, and so I didn't get my master's degree, but I completed everything else. And I moved back to Houston in 1983. My parents were in the auto parts business. It was a family-owned company. And my dad needed help because they'd had some issues with family and whatnot. And so I agreed to come down and help when your father asks you to do something. You can't say no. And so anyway, the little while turned out to be 18 years. And then we ended up closing those business. I got out of the auto parts business, and I went back into the wildlife consulting business. And then I took a job as a director for the Nature Discovery Center in Bel Air, and I was the director there for 8 years. And then I was hired by Commissioner Steve Raddick to build Clubwoods Nature Preserve and Nature Center. And so I went to work for him and did that. And while I was working for him, we had an opportunity to get a hold of Cypress Top Historic Park, and I opened that. And then just recently, a couple of years ago, they built another environmental education center at John Paul Landing, and so I'm in charge of those three parks. But because of redistricting, all that's going to change, and Cypress Top will remain in Precinct 3, and Clubwoods and John Paul Landing will end up in Precinct 4. I'm going to retire in August. Okay. I was I'd been up at A&M for 6 years, and I was well known to the people in the department. And I was also a welder wildlife fellow when I was in graduate school. And Jerry Smith had started the fish-eating bird survey here on the Upper Texas coast, and he had done that in conjunction with the Houston Audubon Society. But it was kind of in name only. There was Houston Audubon Society was brand new. They had just started in '69, and this was in '71, '72 when Jerry was doing all this. So he had contacted Texas Parks and Wildlife and got referred to Clarence Cottom, who was the director at Welder Wildlife Foundation. And Clarence Cottom suggested me to get involved with this fish-eating bird survey. They knowing I was or people at A&M knowing I was going to be returning to Houston. And so Jerry contacted me, and I went out with him a couple of times in the summer of '72. On the second meeting with him, he had arranged with Bruce McCandless, who was one of the Apollo astronauts, to take us flying in Bruce's airplane. And so I went down there, and that was in the summer of '72, and we met at Hobby Airport, and I had a friend with me, Orlin Gaddis, and then there was Jerry Smith and Bruce McCandless. And Bruce had an amphibious plane. And understand at that time all the astronauts were ex-fighter pilots and or test pilots. And when they were astronauts, they had their own private jet sitting at Ellington Field. So if they needed to go to a meeting in Florida, they just went to a meeting in Florida like you would get in your car and go to a meeting downtown or something. And so he and a fellow astronaut had decided that they wanted their own private plane, and they chose this amphibious plane. Well, the reason they chose the amphibious plane was because of all the private planes on the market, it had the most horsepower of any airplane. And it had a cockpit like a jet airplane. It had this canopy all the way over the top. The wings were low, and then the floats were on the bottom of the wings, and the canopy was over the top of you. And so we went flying. I'm not that great of a flyer. And so our quarry that day was trying to find where the Forrester's terns nested. Using boats, Jerry had found all the major colonies in Galveston Bay, but there were all these Forrester terns we knew nested there, and they were very common in the bay, but they didn't know where they nested. And I knew that they nested in marsh habitat, and they were very abundant all summer in West Bay, so they must be in the marshes on West Bay somewhere. And so with that information, we get in this plane and take off, and we fly down to Galveston Bay. We met at Hobby Airport, so it was a short flight over to Galveston Bay. But of course, looking out that airplane, you can't see anything because the wing's in the way. And so we would do this all the way down the backside of Galveston Bay. And sure enough, and of course I was sick as a dog by this time, and sure enough, we found those colonies. In every place there's a long spit of marsh out into Galveston Bay, and if you look at a map, there's lots of those places. There was a few pairs, maybe 100, maybe 10 Forrester tern nesting on all those points. And so we found them, and I think Jerry said, I can't get any pictures. We need to get pictures of that. Well, the astronauts were all issued by NASA a Hasselblad camera, which was the best camera on the market at the time. And they had pistol grip mounts on them. And so all they had to do was pull the trigger and take pictures. And Bruce says, no problem, I know how to get a picture of that. And we got to the end of the island, and he powered up, and he turns upside down. And we fly down the backside of Galveston Bay, upside down. And Bruce is sitting there with his camera, click, 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 through the canopy of the plane, taking pictures of these tern nests on the ground. I was never so glad to get down and get my feet on the ground. But that was my introduction to Bruce McCandless. And Jerry Smith had found the people to carry on that. Well, Jerry Smith had cancer. He had throat cancer, but he had been cured. And this was in the summer of '72 that I just expressed to you. And then I think it was around Easter of the following spring, in '73. And I was planning on moving to Houston in June of '73. And anyway, I got a phone call, and that was before the days of cell phones. And I got this urgent message that I needed to call Jerry, and I called Jerry, and I got his mother, and she said, Jerry's cancer has recurred, and he's in the hospital, and he desperately is asking for you. Can you please come and see him? Well, that I think I got that call on I think it was a Friday. Might have been Thursday and Friday. It was hard to make those connections. It wasn't like today where you just pick up the phone and call somebody. But anyway, so we went down there, and Jerry's on his deathbed. And he says, Fred, will you continue this fish-eating bird survey for me? Will you promise to do that? Well, what can I say? Sure, I promise to do. Well, Jerry died the next day after I saw him, and everybody said he was just fighting to stay alive till he could talk to me. And so I moved down here in June of '73 and continued with the fish-eating bird survey, and built a friendship with Bruce McCandless as a result of all of that, and got more and more involved with the Houston Audubon Society. And I don't know exactly what the date is. Y'all may know. But the board, the Houston Audubon board, was structured differently then than it is now, and they decided to create a place on the board for me, and I became their science officer or something. I can't remember what it was. National Audubon Society decided that they wanted to have local chapters. And National Audubon was pretty focused in New York. And they decided to have these local chapters. They felt like they needed to get down to earth or something. But anyway, they started these local chapters. Well, they would go to local groups in the community. Well, in the case of Houston, there was the Outdoor Nature Club and the Ornithology Group, and they had been in existence since the 1920s, and it had been a very strong conservation organization in the 20s and 30s. And they had done some significant things. They had created and nurtured Van Toon Island in Galveston Bay, and it became a major bird rookery. And they did that, and they protected that. They had done some other things that were very proactive, that were well known. So when National Audubon came down here, they asked the Outdoor Nature Club if they wanted to be the national group, and the Outdoor Nature Club had Little Thicket Nature Sanctuary, and they had a very active membership, and they had all these different subgroups. They had a shell group, and they had a mushroom group, and they had a botany group, and they had an entomology group, and they had a bird group, and they were all very active. And but they were also people that had been around since the 20s, and National Audubon Society went, everybody that belongs to National Audubon is going to be part of your group. And they went, no. We're not going to do that. We vote on our members, and we're going to vote on our members. We're not going to just take anybody. Well, that wouldn't fly, obviously. And so some people in the Outdoor Nature Club branched off, and they created Houston Audubon Society, and that's how Houston Audubon Society got started. But it was an immediate division and branch of an existing organization. And so that happened, I think, in '69. And so I came on the board in '73, and pretty much all that Houston Audubon had done in that time period was sort of get organized so they could send out these newsletters to all these people. And back in those days, it was very complicated, and we would get in the mail, we would get this big batch of labels, and that was who your membership was at that point in time, and you put the labels on your newsletter and you mail them, and very laborious, and there's thousands of labels that you had, so it was a big job. And so and the postage was expensive, so between doing that and showing these movies that Audubon was passing around the country, that was about all they had managed to do. By the fall of '73, I started becoming an active member of the board. And some were fairly close. they had an opportunity to get Edith Elmore Sanctuary, and that was a big decision. Mrs. Moore wanted to give them the property. She wanted to live out her life here, and she wanted the place to be, maintained in a woodland habitat. She wanted kids to be able to always be able to come here. She had 6 or 7 big rescued black dogs that looked horribly fearsome, but they were all sweethearts. But she lived in that cabin with all these dogs and kids running wild all over the place, and she was very happy with that, and she wanted to make sure that it would continue. And but because the group that had started this had been kind of the more active people in the Outdoor Nature Club who were very interested in some of the environmental issues in Houston and how they affected specific sites and birds and whatnot, there was this strong advocacy thing to protect these certain places. And so they kept trying to get involved with that. They tried to review Corps permits on a regular basis, which that was an impossible task because there's Corps permits almost every day, even back then. And so then this idea of the sanctuary came up. And Rob Dahay was very much for this sanctuary. And but if we took the sanctuary and were unable to get it exempted from ad valorem tax, the taxes on the property would be more than we had in income. So it was a really risky proposition to accept the sanctuary because we weren't sure we could even pay the taxes, much less do anything else with it. So they voted on that, and it was only through the strength of Rob that it passed. And I was a token against it vote when they voted because they were talking about spending, $7,000 or $8,000 a year on taxes for this property. And my argument was you could do a load of programs for school kids with that much money. And but anyway, they voted to accept it, and it was a great decision. And it was complicated, and Rob worked through all those issues, and he took care of Mrs. Moore. He took care of the dogs. When Mrs. Moore passed away, Dee Oakey and her husband, I can't remember his name, Ross, his name was Ross, they moved into the cabin as sort of caretakers, and they took care of all those dogs. And they lived there for several years, and at some point they moved out, and they took the remaining dogs with them and took care of those dogs for the rest of those dogs' lives. And so that was quite a thing. So then Houston Audubon became a property owner and became a sanctuary owner, and that kind of changed the makeup of the organization in a lot of ways because you had these physical responsibilities that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. One of the things that they got involved in very early, and I don't remember exactly when, but it was the Wallaceville water project of the city of Houston. And the Sierra Club and a couple other people in Houston Audubon Society all filed suit against that project, against the Corps of Engineers to construct that project. And it dragged on and dragged on and dragged on. And there was I don't remember the lawyer's name. I think Jim Blackburn may have worked for him as an intern, but Jim Blackburn wasn't a lawyer at the time. He was still in law school. And this lawyer, kind of much to his surprise, won the initial round, and so stopped the construction of the thing. And of course, the Corps in the city of Houston appealed, and they, And so it started, and so this appeals process was like a never-ending money pit. And everybody dropped out of supporting the lawyer financially except Houston Audubon. And that was difficult for Houston Audubon Society. And by the time all that happened, Ken Burns had come on the board to primarily raise funds. And he managed to raise the money to pay that lawyer, and the lawyer was very grateful because the lawyer was stuck. From his own personal perspective, professional perspective, he couldn't withdraw from the suit, and so he was stuck doing all this work, and it was substantial, for nothing. And so all he ever asked for was to cover his actual expenses, and Houston Audubon was able to see that through, and they won the lawsuit. And so that project went from 50,000 acres to 5,000 acres, and of course it never provided Houston with any drinking water, which was a supposed reason they got involved in the first place. The Houston Audubon logo, which they made an original patch for the HAS logo, which reminds me, I don't have one of those anymore. I got to get one. It was a beautiful patch, and it's the yellow-throated warbler. And I don't. I think it was Ben Feltner who had suggested that bird. And Ben Feltner was a bird guide, and he was very active in the Houston area for a long time. So he'd moved to Houston from England in the 1950s, and he and Vic Emanuel birded a great deal together in the 50s and 60s, and started a birding company together. But in the meantime, Vic had split off and had gone to Austin, and Ben had stayed here. But anyway, Ben suggested the yellow-throated warbler, and his wife, Linda Feltner, was an artist, a very fine artist, wildlife artist, and she had she made a sample logo of this yellow-throated warbler on hanging on moss, and everybody really liked it. Gary Clark, of course, Gary Clark's with the Houston Chronicle and wrote for them for 20 plus years after John Tweeden passed on. But anyway, he thought the whole idea was very poetic, because Houston at the time was often referred to as the Bio City, and the Spanish moss and the warbler inhabit the bios of the community, and the bird is here year-round. It nests here, and it's here in the winter. It's also a common migrant, so it made a good choice, and its markings are very black and white with this pop of yellow on the throat, and it made a beautiful patch, and everybody liked it, and it was adopted and went on the letterhead, although I don't think they ever put it in color on the letterhead, and it would have made it really beautiful. But back in those days, color on the letterhead was pretty classy. Okay. Marianne Weber is the educational bird person here at Houston Audubon Society, and has been, I guess, for 25 years now. And she is a interesting young woman, and when she was 25 years ago, it's long, yeah, I guess about 25 years is right. Anyway, she was living in Wyoming. She was a very young woman at the time, and she had all these educational raptors. I think she had 8 or 9 of them, and she was working in Wyoming. She was married, and she had an infant son, and things fell apart with her marriage, and she decided to come back to Houston. And I have no idea how she got my contact information, but I was the director of the Nature Discovery Center in Bel Air. And she contacted me and, wanted to know if there was any chance of her being hired as a naturalist educator there. And I told her that I really didn't have any openings, but I'd like to interview her and ask her to go ahead and come in. And I said, when can you be here? And she said, tomorrow morning or day after tomorrow. I can't remember what, she said basically immediately. And I said, well, that's fine. And I put it on the calendar. And so the morning comes and she's there, and it was, I think it was a 10 or 10:30 appointment. And she's there, and she's very, very, very thin and very pale, and she had on a black wool suit. And this was springtime in Houston, and it was relatively warm, And she was, and I typically when I would interview people, I would take them out into the park, and we would walk around the facilities in the park and talk about stuff. And that way, I have an opportunity to ask them about plants or birds or whatever, and see what their expertise is with local fauna and whatnot. And so we start walking around the walkway around the nature center, and she just seems to walk a little slower and with each step, and she's just pale as a ghost. And I turned and said something to her, and her eyes just kind of glazed over, and she started just working her way toward the ground. And I lunged for her and caught her, and but she was kind of away. So by the time I caught her, all I could do was just lay her down so she didn't get hurt, and laid her right down there on the walkway. And in a few minutes, she came to, and I gave her we gave her some orange juice and kind of revived her and sent her on home. And we didn't really have an opening for her, but she had impressed me so much, in spite of the fact that she turned pale and fainted, that I called Gretchen Mueller, who was a good friend, who was acting director of Houston Audubon at the time. And I said, I just interviewed a lady, and she's got great credentials, and she's very personable, and she's an absolute ultimate fit for Houston Audubon. If y'all don't hire her, y'all are all a bunch of idiots. Well, Gretchen interviewed her the next day and hired her the following day, and she's been here ever since, and obviously been a great employee. But what I didn't know until I found out later is that Mary Ann had driven straight through from Wyoming all the way down here with these birds and an infant son, stopping periodically to check them all, hit the road again. She had driven almost straight through, was exhausted, hadn't had hardly any sleep, probably hadn't had anything to eat, and here she shows up at this interview. So if that's not Mary Ann, I don't know what it is. She's got great gumption. She's just a fabulous person. It started with Rob Dehay, who was the president when I came to the Houston Audubon Society board and involvement. And Rob Dehay was an architect, extremely talented architect. He was an artist. He was a bird watcher. And Audubon gave him the opportunity to use all those talents and interest for the betterment of the community. And, I've seen that over and over with my involvement with Houston Audubon, and how people have stepped up, and sometimes they surprise you. Ted Eubank, I knew Ted when he was going to school. He's a journalist, and he was, a delivery boy, and then after he got out of school, he started a delivery company, and he was doing that. But Ted's obviously become one of the finest conservationists in the state of Texas, and certainly has done a lot nationally and internationally to promote birds and people getting involved with nature. And so you see this sort of thing. There's so many others that have just been extraordinary, more than I could even begin to name. Steny Meadows has done a lot of remarkable things. Joy Hester was a big contributor. One of the first people on the Audubon board was Katrina Ladwig, and Katrina, she had many more talents than people knew, and she was always ready to step up and help somebody do any and everything if it benefited Audubon. And I think she was an inspiration for Laura Singleton. And so it just really is a remarkable thing, because people see that they can, affect the community. They can affect positive things for birds and wildlife and people all. And so Houston Audubon helps people fulfill possibilities that a lot of times they didn't know that they had it in them. And that's probably been the best thing about Houston Audubon, is how it's allowed a platform for these people. And once Houston Audubon started being able to hire people, you found the same thing turning up with the staff that they've had. And, Winnie Burkett did some remarkable things, and Marianne Weber we talked about, she's done some remarkable things. And so it really is a great organization, and it's a great organization because it benefits these people, and these people benefit the organization. My early involvement with Houston Audubon was kind of accidental almost. It was but doing the fish-eating bird survey drew me into the inner circles of Audubon, so to speak, and then I became involved in the operation of Audubon Society, and that's how that works. And there's a lot of 20-year-olds out there with a huge amount of knowledge, potential, and energy, and a certain amount of naivete that allows them to do things above what they actually might think they're capable of. And that's young people are very important when you can get them. But at the same time, most of the people that have really benefited Audubon as presidents and whatnot, many of them are retirement age people. And so they all have things to contribute. A lot of people retire fairly young, and they're looking for one more mountain to climb. And Houston Audubon Society often provides that. Steve Gast is probably one of the better examples of that. He's got a lot of he's done a lot for Audubon, but he's got a lot of potential right now for Audubon and the Katy Prairie Conservancy. And the environmental community has grown exponentially in my lifetime. And a lot of times when I meet with groups at conferences and whatnot, I make a point to tell them, I make them all ask a question. Anybody whose job existed in 1970, raise your hand. Of course, nobody can raise their hand because that job that they have didn't exist in 1970. And and you could do the same thing here, um, and that's good. It shows we're getting somewhere, and things may look bleak, but they've been a whole lot bleaker. We made a lot of progress, and sometimes people lose sight of that, and it's important that people don't lose sight of that. And all of those people out there, all these young people running around, they're going to make something with their life, and it would be nice if it was something was used in Audubon something. Well, the first time I went to Highland was, I think, in '69, and I was a student at A&M at the time, and I was working on Dr. Arnold's snipe crew, and we banded common snipe, caught them and banded common snipe. So only an Aggie can work his way through college catching snipe. But anyway, we had gone down to Anahuac National Wildlife Refuge and spent the weekend. They let us camp out in their maintenance shed, and we had been banding snipe all weekend. And actually, we'd do that on a holiday weekend, and I don't know what it was, maybe Easter or something. We were down there doing that. And when we got done, on the way back to College Station, well, certainly going south and east is on the way back to College Station, right? So anyway, we took a swing down through Highland and Bolivar, and Smith Oaks was known to birders, but it was the first time I had been there. I'd heard about the place, and so we pulled into Smith Oaks, and you went down that back street and parked at the farmhouse that was right there at the edge of the woods, and went in, and there was a fellow that was banding birds in there. He had permission to band birds in there every year, and he was a MD doctor, and he banded spring migrants all the time. And Betsy Cornelius was there helping him. And so I show up with this snipe crew, probably 4 or 5 of us, I don't remember how many. And we go walking in there, looking at birds and meeting this doctor, and Betsy Cornelius was there, and I'd never met Betsy Cornelius. And I don't know why, but she chose me. She came up and she grabbed me by the arm, and she said, we introduced ourselves and whatnot, and she said, well, Fred Collins, you have to do something about this place. And I said, pardon? A 20-year-old college kid. She comes up and grabs me by the arm. And so she starts walking me through the woods and saying, Fish and Wildlife won't do anything about this place, and she's just carrying on and on. And she says, you have to do something, Fred. And I just, it was absolutely remarkable. And so anyway, we bird watched and left, and went back to A&M, and so it was very ironic. A few years later, it was like, that was '69, so about 13, 14 years later, I'm buying Highland. So anyway, it was something that struck me all the time. And of course, as soon as we showed any interest as an organization in Highland, Betsy Cornelius was there every step of the way, and trying to do any and everything to help. And when we made the commitment to buy the Lewis Smith property, Betsy Cornelius immediately went to work in Beaumont, and she raised about $10,000 in Beaumont for that project. So she was very helpful the whole way, but it always struck me why she decided to grab a hold of me. I didn't know her from Adam, and she didn't know me from Adam, and it was like, she said, Fred, you have to do something about this place. It's hard for people today to understand any of that. But as long as there's been people in bird watching, you hear about some good bird somebody saw and you want to go see that bird. That's kind of a innate thing among bird watchers, whether they admit it or whatnot. They just, if somebody sees a cool bird, you just really want to see that cool bird. And it can be not necessarily a rare bird, just unusual in an area or something, or maybe it's a really rarity. Well, back in the '70s, you could phone call somebody, you could write them a letter, and obviously writing somebody a letter about a rare bird is not going to help them find the bird. So you have to call them, and of course nobody had a cell phone; it was all landlines, and so you call their house, and not too many people had answering machines, and so you kind of begin to see the problem. And there were these things called phone trees, and everybody had two people that they had to call and tell this message to. And so somebody would call you and tell you, oh, there's a, wandering tattler down at the jetty at Galveston. And so you would call the two people on your list and make sure you got a hold of them and told them that. And they would call the people on their list. And so all these people would do that. Well, NARBA was sort of that way. But I think that email may have been in existence by the time NARBA had come along. Certainly, phone messages were much more common, but it was still pre-cell phone days, and it was still most people did not have email at the time. And so NARBA was a national program that you would hear about this rare bird alert. And the way NARBA worked is, if you subscribed to NARBA, you gave them your name and phone number. And if a bird on your list showed up, they would call you. And so these people that were chasing birds all over the countryside would get a phone call from NARBA that there's a bird there. And the way that had evolved, I think by the time we bought it, was they had a machine that would make robocalls. But somebody had to answer the NARBA phone and get the information for the original sighting. So it was an intense one-person job to take this call from anybody, anywhere, anytime, and get this information about this bird and then put it out on the call alert. And that was started as a private company by somebody that just really wanted to do that. And it had gotten so big and so complicated, and this person didn't want to do it anymore, and so they were looking to sell it. And of course, nobody wanted to make that commitment, and nobody wanted to come up with any money. But it made all the sense in the world for an organization like Houston Audubon to do it. Because it was a potential money maker for Houston Audubon. The only hang-up was who's going to take those phone calls. You can't just hire somebody off the street, at a beginning wage and have them take these calls. It has to be a very knowledgeable, experienced bird watcher to do that. Well, one of the people that was chasing birds all over the United States was Mike Austin, and he was a Houston Audubon member, and he subscribed to NARBA, and so he found out about all this, and he was told that Houston Audubon was negotiating with NARBA about all this, and he contacted Houston Audubon, and he says, I'll take those phone calls. And of course, he wanted to take those phone calls because he wanted to chase that bird. He wanted to be, he'd know before anybody else he could go chase that bird. And so that agreement was made, and he took those phone calls and did the rare bird alert, and then I think somebody with Audubon would actually, make it all happen. But Mike was the person that screened it and put the bird on the rare bird alert. And in those days, you couldn't just get a picture across the country either, so it was a a little tenuous. But anyway, that's how Norba came about, and it worked out, and it's evolved, and now it's an email service. And I don't know if it's making money for Audubon still or not, but it it's lasted a lot longer than I think anybody would have thought with changes in technology.